Welcome back, viewers, to another exciting episode of our tech series. Today, we'll be diving into the fascinating world of computer hardware and exploring the basic input-output system, or BIOS, which plays a crucial role in ensuring the smooth functioning of your computer. So, let's get started. BIOS, Basic Input-Output System. I can provide you with an overview of the computer BIOS, Basic Input-Output System, points to cover various aspects. The BIOS is a firmware embedded in the computer's motherboard that initializes hardware components and provides the basic input and output services needed for the system to boot up and interact with devices. Some important key points. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. It is a firmware that resides in a chip on the computer's motherboard. The BIOS is responsible for initializing hardware components during the boot process. It provides a bridge between the computer's hardware and software. The BIOS is typically written in low-level programming languages like assembly language. It is non-volatile, meaning it retains its settings even when the power is turned off. The BIOS is stored in a ROM, read-only memory, chip. In modern computers, the BIOS is often replaced by the newer UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. The BIOS is the first software that runs when a computer is powered on. It performs a power-on self-test, POST, to check the hardware's integrity. The BIOS detects and initializes system devices such as the processor, memory, and hard drives. It provides a user interface to configure various system settings. BIOS settings can be accessed by pressing a specific key during the boot process, example, F2, Del, or ESC. It manages the boot sequence and determines from which device the computer should boot. The BIOS interacts with the operating system to handle I/O operations. It provides services for disk management, including reading and writing data to storage devices. The BIOS manages the system clock and keeps track of time. It enables the computer to communicate with peripheral devices like keyboards, mice, and printers. The BIOS provides support for legacy hardware and software. It includes error handling mechanisms to handle hardware failures or configuration issues. The BIOS can be updated to fix bugs, improve compatibility, or add new features. The process of updating the BIOS is called flashing. Flashing the BIOS carries some risks and should be done cautiously. The BIOS supports power management features like ACPI, Advanced Configuration and Power Interface. It controls the behavior of the computer's fans and temperature sensors. The BIOS stores system-specific information, such as the serial number and model number. It can be password protected to prevent unauthorized access to system settings. The BIOS can be reset to its default settings if needed. Some advanced BIOS settings allow overclocking the CPU or memory. The BIOS can provide hardware-level security features, such as Secure Boot and TPM, Trusted Platform Module, support. These bullet points cover the fundamental aspects of the computer BIOS, its functions, and its significance in the overall system operation. Now we try to understand about BIOS version. I can provide you with information about BIOS version and revision changes made between 1995 and 2023, along with the definition of BIOS version. Definition. BIOS version. A BIOS version refers to a specific release or iteration of the computer's BIOS firmware. It is typically represented by a combination of numbers and letters that indicate the version number and potentially additional information about the firmware. Changes in BIOS versions and revisions 1995 to 2023. In the mid-1990s, BIOS versions were primarily focused on basic hardware initialization and providing essential system services. BIOS versions during this period were often stored on ROM chips and required physical replacement to update. The transition from MS-DOS to Windows prompted changes in BIOS to support new operating system features and drivers. As the demand for plug-and-play functionality increased, BIOS versions introduced features like ACPI Advanced Configuration and Power Interface to manage power states and device configuration. The late 1990s saw the introduction of flashable BIOS, which allowed for software updates without physical chip replacement. BIOS versions started including graphical user interfaces (GUIs) to provide easier navigation and configuration options. Manufacturers began integrating BIOS update utilities into the firmware, allowing for easier and more convenient updates. BIOS versions became more modular, allowing for the update of specific components without flashing the entire firmware. The adoption of the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface (UEFI) as a replacement for traditional BIOS started in the early 2000s. UEFI brought significant changes, including support for larger hard drives, improved boot performance, and a more advanced user interface. BIOS versions introduced support for newer technologies like USB, SATA, PCI Express, and solid-state drives (SSDs). Security features such as Secure Boot, TPM Trusted Platform Module, and BIOS-level passwords were added to enhance system protection. BIOS versions enabled customization of boot logos and settings for computer manufacturers. Improvements in BIOS versions included enhanced error handling and diagnostics for easier troubleshooting. Support for advanced CPU features like hyperthreading, virtualization, and overclocking was incorporated into BIOS versions. BIOS versions started offering options for fan control and temperature monitoring to optimize system cooling. Manufacturers introduced BIOS recovery mechanisms to prevent firmware corruption during the update process. Some BIOS versions began providing built-in network boot capabilities for remote operating system installation. UEFI Secure Boot was introduced to ensure that only trusted and signed firmware and operating systems are loaded during boot. BIOS versions started including support for multiple language interfaces to cater to a global user base. The shift towards cloud computing led to BIOS versions with features for remote management and virtualization. BIOS versions became more user-friendly, offering context-sensitive help and tool tips. With the rise of mobile computing, BIOS versions introduced power management optimizations for laptops and tablets. BIOS versions started incorporating self-healing mechanisms to recover from firmware failures. UEFI Shell, a command line environment, was added to BIOS versions to provide advanced configuration and scripting capabilities. BIOS versions offered support for advanced hardware features like Thunderbolt, NVMe, and 3D graphics cards. Enhancements in BIOS versions focused on reducing boot times and improving overall system performance. BIOS versions included better integration with operating system features such as Windows Fast Boot and Hibernate modes. Secure firmware update mechanisms, such as capsule updates, were introduced to protect against malicious firmware modifications. BIOS versions began supporting virtualization technologies like Intel VTX and AMD V. These bullet points highlight the major changes and enhancements made in BIOS versions and revisions between 1995 and 2023, reflecting the evolution of BIOS firmware over time to accommodate new technologies, improve functionality, and enhance system performance and security. How to access various settings of the BIOS setup utility. Here's a detailed guide on how to access the BIOS and make changes to various settings. First, start or restart your computer. Look for a message on the screen during the boot process that indicates the key to access the BIOS. It is usually displayed as, "Press key to enter setup," or a similar message. Common keys include Del, F2, F10, or ESC. Press the designated key to enter the BIOS. Note that you need to press it before the operating system starts loading. Once inside the BIOS, you'll see a text-based or graphical interface, depending on the version and manufacturer. The BIOS interface typically consists of menus and options navigated using the keyboard. Familiarize yourself with the BIOS layout, which may have tabs or sections for different settings. Use the arrow keys on your keyboard to navigate within the BIOS menus and options. To select a menu or option, use the Enter key. The Main tab often displays basic system information such as the date, time, and installed hardware. The Advanced tab provides access to more detailed settings like CPU, memory, and peripheral configurations. The Boot tab allows you to manage the boot order and choose which device the computer should boot from first. The Security tab allows you to set BIOS and system security options, such as passwords and secure boot. The Power tab may contain settings related to power management, sleep modes, and power-related features. The Exit tab or section provides options to save changes and exit the BIOS or discard changes and exit. To change a specific setting, select the corresponding option using the arrow keys and press Enter. Some settings may have submenus that you can access by selecting them and pressing Enter. Use the instructions displayed on the screen to navigate and modify the desired settings. You may be able to choose from a list of options or enter values manually. When changing values, use the plus or dash keys to increase or decrease the setting, if applicable. Pay attention to any warnings or prompts that appear when modifying critical settings. Be cautious when making changes, as incorrect settings can lead to system instability or boot issues. If unsure about a particular setting, refer to the manufacturer's documentation or online resources for guidance. Some BIOS versions offer the ability to load optimized default settings or a fail-safe default configuration if needed. To save changes made in the BIOS, navigate to the Exit tab or section. Select the option to save changes and exit the BIOS, usually labeled as Save Changes and Exit. Confirm your selection if prompted and wait for the computer to restart. If you do not wish to save changes, select the option to discard changes and exit. After exiting the BIOS, the computer will restart with the updated settings. If you encounter issues or mistakenly modify critical settings, you can often revert to default BIOS settings by selecting the Load Default Settings or a similar option in the BIOS. It's important to note that different computer manufacturers and BIOS versions may have slight variations in their interfaces and options. Consulting the documentation specific to your system is advisable for accurate instructions. Remember to exercise caution when modifying BIOS settings, as incorrect changes can have adverse effects on your system. Thanks for watching my video. I try to make more video for you. You can also check my related video in I button. If you like my video, please subscribe and share with your family and friends.